What kind of woman teaches a shy 7-year-old to find her voice through ballet while living in a wheelchair at 83? And why did a struggling single father, delivering groceries, find himself holding back tears when he discovered his daughter spinning through the corridors of Willowbrook Care Center with a former prima ballerina who hadn't danced in 20 years? This isn't a story about dance lessons. It's about grace found in unexpected places and the kind of healing that happens when two broken spirits recognize each other across generations. If stories like this move you, consider subscribing, because sometimes the most beautiful choreography happens when no one's watching and everyone's given up hope. Now, let's begin. Sylvain Mariche thought he was just delivering groceries to make ends meet. He had no idea he was about to witness a miracle that would change 3 lives forever. This is their story. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Thursday mornings in Silverbrook had a particular quality of desperation. The kind that settled into your bones when the rent was due in 3 days and your bank account showed $17.43. Sylvain Mariche knew this feeling intimately as he loaded the last crate of organic vegetables into his weathered Honda Civic, the suspension groaning under the weight of hope disguised as produce. At 32, Sylvain had learned that pride was a luxury he couldn't afford. Not since the divorce. Not since Emma had taken half of everything and left him with full custody of their 7-year-old daughter, Aria, and a mountain of legal debt that grew faster than his ability to pay it down. The irony wasn't lost on him that a man trained in logistics and strategic planning during his 5 years in the service now struggled to plan beyond his next meal. Willowbrook Care Center sat on the outskirts of Silverbrook, like a forgotten thought, all weathered brick and institutional beige. It was Sylvain's least favorite delivery stop, not because of the residents, but because the place reminded him of impermanence, of how quickly life could strip away everything you thought was permanent. The automatic doors wheezed open as he approached, arms loaded with canvas bags filled with organic kale and gluten-free crackers that cost more than his weekly grocery budget. The lobby smelled of disinfectant trying unsuccessfully to mask something deeper, more human. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting everything in a sickly pallor that made even the artificial flowers look depressed. Behind the reception desk, a tired woman with kind eyes and graying roots glanced up from her paperwork. "Mr. Mariche," she said with genuine warmth. "Right on time as always." Sylvain managed a smile. "Thursdays and Mondays, Mrs. Patterson, like clockwork." "Room 237 again today." Mrs. Corvain specifically requested the organic spinach. She lowered her voice conspiratorially. "Between you and me, I think she just likes having someone to talk to who isn't paid to listen." As Sylvain made his way down the long corridor, his footsteps echoed against linoleum floors that had seen better decades. The walls were decorated with motivational posters featuring kittens and rainbows, the kind of aggressive cheerfulness that only served to highlight how much cheer was actually missing from this place. He passed residents sitting in wheelchairs, some staring out windows at a world they could no longer fully participate in, others lost in the fog of memories that belonged to people they used to be. Room 237 was different. The door was slightly ajar, and from within came the sound of something he hadn't expected: music. Not the generic background noise that usually played in these facilities, but real music. Classical, complex, with strings that seemed to tell a story of their own. Sylvain knocked gently and pushed the door open. Talise Corvain sat in her wheelchair by the window, her silver hair pulled back in an elegant bun despite being 83 years old. She wore a soft lavender cardigan over a simple dress, and her posture was ramrod straight in a way that suggested decades of discipline. Her room was unlike any other in the facility, no institutional furniture here. Instead, vintage photographs lined the walls. Images of dancers in motion. Theater programs from decades past, and in the corner, an old record player spinning a vinyl that had seen countless plays. "Ah, my Thursday night," she said without turning around, her voice carrying the faint traces of what might have been a European accent, softened by decades in America. "I was beginning to think you'd forgotten about an old woman and her vegetable obsession." Sylvan set the bags on her small table, noting the grace in her movements as she turned her wheelchair to face him. Even confined to wheels, there was something about her bearing that suggested she had once commanded stages, not struggled with doorways. Never forget a customer. Mrs. Corvain, especially one who tips in wisdom instead of cash. She laughed, a sound like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. "Wisdom is all I have left to give, dear one. Everything else has been taken by time or circumstance." Her eyes, still sharp and blue as winter sky, studied him with the intensity of someone who had spent a lifetime reading people's bodies, understanding what they communicated beyond words. "You look tired today." "More than usual." Sylvan began unpacking the groceries, arranging them in her small refrigerator with practiced efficiency. "Just the usual. Work, bills, trying to keep everything together." He paused, then decided to be honest. "My daughter starts school next month, and I'm not sure how I'm going to manage the after-school care. The delivery schedule doesn't exactly align with a 7-year-old's needs." "Aria, isn't it?" Tallis asked softly. "You've mentioned her before. The shy one who loves to watch old movies." "That's her. Sweet kid, but she's been struggling since the divorce. Doesn't talk much anymore. Spends most of her time in her room. I keep thinking I should do more, but I'm barely keeping my head above water as it is." Tallis was quiet for a moment, her fingers drumming silently against the arm of her wheelchair in what looked like muscle memory. When she spoke again, her voice had a different quality, as if she was speaking from a place deeper than casual conversation. "Do you know what I did before I came to this place, Sylvan?" He stopped arranging vegetables and looked at her. In all the months he'd been delivering to her, she'd never volunteered personal information, beyond pleasantries and occasional observations about the weather or the state of modern produce. "I assumed you were a teacher, maybe. You have that way about you." "I was a dancer," she said simply. "Principal ballerina with the Metropolitan Opera Ballet for 15 years. Before that, I trained in Paris, performed in London, danced for audiences who understood that movement could tell stories words couldn't capture." She gestured to the photographs on the walls, and Sylvan looked at them with new eyes, seeing now the same elegant posture, the same grace, captured in moments of artistic transcendence. "I retired at 45 after an injury. Spent another 20 years teaching young dancers how to find their voices through movement. Then my husband died, my health declined, and here I am, watching my body forget everything it once knew how to do." She paused, her gaze shifting to the window where afternoon light filtered through gauze curtains. "But muscle memory is a curious thing, Sylvan. The body remembers even when the mind insists it's forgotten." Something in her tone made him stop what he was doing completely. "Mrs. Corvain, why are you telling me this?" She turned back to him, and her expression had changed. There was something almost fierce in her eyes, a spark that suggested the fire that had once driven her to stages across the world hadn't been completely extinguished by time and circumstance. Because shy little girls who love old movies often understand stories told through movement better than those told through words. And because sometimes the most beautiful dances happen not on stages, but in quiet rooms where no one expects miracles. The silence that followed was pregnant with possibility, though Sylvan couldn't quite grasp what she was suggesting. The music from her record player swelled, filling the space between them with something that felt like invitation. Though to what, he wasn't sure. As he finished the delivery and prepared to leave, Tallis called after him. "Sylvan, next Thursday, would you consider bringing Aria with you?" I promise you, no harm will come to her here. But I have a feeling that little girl might benefit from learning that sometimes the most important conversations happen without words. He paused in the doorway, looking back at this elegant woman who had just offered something he couldn't quite name, but somehow knew his daughter needed. I'll think about it, Mrs. Corvain. Please do, she said softly. And Sylvan? Sometimes the help we need comes from the most unexpected places. The following Thursday arrived with the kind of restless energy that makes decisions for you. Arya had been sitting at the kitchen table for 20 minutes, methodically arranging her cereal into small piles while avoiding Sylvan's attempts at conversation. She did this more often lately, retreating into herself like a turtle pulling into its shell whenever the world felt too big or too complicated. You want to come with Dad today? Sylvan asked, trying to keep his voice casual as he packed the delivery bags. Just for a ride. We won't be long. We won't be long. Arya looked up from her cereal architecture, her dark eyes serious in the way that only 7-year-old eyes could be when they'd seen too much change too quickly. Where are we going? Just to deliver some groceries to a nice lady who lives at Willowbrook. She asked about you last week. Why would she ask about me? She doesn't know me. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. It was a fair question, and Sylvan found himself without a good answer. Sometimes grown-ups are curious about other people's families. She seems lonely. Arya considered this with the gravity of a judge weighing evidence. After a long moment, she nodded once. Okay, but I don't want to talk to anyone. You don't have to talk to anyone, sweetheart. You can just wait in the car if you want. The drive to Willowbrook was quiet, except for the radio playing softly and the rhythmic sound of Arya's fingers tapping against the window in patterns only she understood. Sylvan glanced at her in the rearview mirror, noting how small she looked in the backseat, how her shoulders curved inward as if she was trying to take up as little space as possible. When they arrived at the care center, Arya's eyes widened at the size of the building. It's like a hospital, she whispered. Kind of, but it's where people live when they need help taking care of themselves. It's their home. Mrs. Patterson's face lit up when she saw them enter together. And this must be the famous Arya we've heard so much about. Arya immediately moved closer to Sylvan, pressing against his leg like a shadow seeking shelter. He placed a protective hand on her shoulder. She's a little shy, he explained. Nothing wrong with being thoughtful about new places, Mrs. Patterson said kindly. Mrs. Corvain is expecting you both. Room 237, same as always. As they walked down the corridor, Sylvan noticed Arya's head swiveling to take in everything, the residents in their wheelchairs, the nurses moving with practiced efficiency. The way sound seemed to echo differently in these wide hallways. Her fingers had stopped their tapping, which usually meant she was processing something that required her full attention. They reached room 237, and again, music drifted from within. But this time it was different, not just the classical pieces Talise usually played, but something lighter, more playful. Sylvan knocked and heard her voice call for them to enter. Talise was positioned differently today. Instead of by the window, her wheelchair was in the center of the room, and she'd somehow created more space by moving furniture against the walls. The afternoon light streamed in more directly, casting geometric patterns across the floor that shifted and danced as clouds moved across the sun. Sylvan, she said warmly, then turned her attention to the little girl half hidden behind his legs. And you must be Arya. I'm Talise, but you can call me whatever feels comfortable to you. Arya peeked out from behind Sylvan but didn't speak. Her eyes, however, were busy, taking in the photographs on the walls, the way the light played across the floor, the gentle motion of Talise's hands as she spoke. I hope you don't mind, Talise continued. but I was just listening to some of my old practice music. It helps me remember what it felt like to move the way I used to." She gestured to her legs with matter-of-fact acceptance. "These don't work quite the way they used to, but the music still sounds the same." Sylvan began unpacking the groceries, but he found himself distracted by the way Arya was studying the room. She'd taken a few steps away from him and was now standing near one of the photographs, a black and white image of a young woman in a tutu, captured mid-leap with her arms extended like wings. "That was taken in 1962, Tully said softly, noticing Arya's attention. "I was 25, performing Giselle at the Lincoln Center. Do you know what a grand jeet is, dear one?" Arya shook her head but didn't look away from the photograph. "It's when a dancer leaps through the air with their legs extended, like they're trying to fly. For just a moment, you're completely free from gravity, suspended between earth and sky." Tallis's voice had taken on a dreamy quality, as if she was seeing not just the photograph, but the memory it contained. "The trick isn't in the jumping, though. It's in believing, just for that instant, that you belong in the air." Something about her tone made Arya turn to look at her directly for the first time. "Does it hurt when you land?" "Sometimes," Tallis admitted. "But the flying part makes it worth it." Sylvan had stopped unpacking entirely now, transfixed by this exchange. Arya hadn't spoken to a stranger in months, yet here she was asking questions, engaging in a way that felt almost miraculous after weeks of monosyllabic responses and withdrawn silence. "Would you like to see something interesting?" Tallis asked, and when Arya nodded, she positioned her wheelchair so she was facing the young girl directly. "Even though my legs don't work the way they used to, my arms remember how to dance. Would you like to see?" Without waiting for an answer, Tallis raised her arms, and something extraordinary happened. Despite being confined to her wheelchair, despite being 83 years old, despite everything that age and circumstance had taken from her, her upper body began to move with a grace that seemed to defy the laws of physics. Her arms flowed like water, her shoulders rolled like waves. Her head tilted and turned with the kind of precision that spoke of decades of training and muscle memory that transcended physical limitation. The music swelled, and Tallis's movements grew more complex. She was telling a story with her body, a story about yearning, about reaching for something just beyond grasp, about finding beauty in constraint. Her fingers traced patterns in the air that seemed to leave invisible trails, and her expression transformed from that of an elderly woman in a care facility to something timeless, ageless, purely artistic. Arya stood transfixed, her mouth slightly open, her entire body leaning forward as if drawn by some invisible force. And then, almost without conscious thought, her own arms began to rise. Tentatively at first, then with growing confidence, she began to mirror some of Tallis's movements. Not copying exactly, but responding, interpreting, finding her own way into the conversation of movement. Sylvan felt his breath catch in his throat. He'd never seen his daughter move like this, with such focus, such unconscious grace, such complete absorption in the moment. For the first time in months, she looked not like a little girl carrying the weight of too much change, but like exactly what she was, a 7-year-old, discovering something wonderful. The music reached a crescendo and then gently faded, leaving the three of them in a silence that felt full rather than empty. Tallis lowered her arms slowly, and Arya did the same. Their movements synchronized in a way that suggested they'd been dancing together for years rather than minutes. "That was beautiful, dear one," Tallis said softly. "You have very expressive arms. They want to tell stories." Arya looked down at her own hands as if seeing them for the first time. "I don't know any stories." "Oh, but you do," Tallis replied with gentle certainty. "Everyone does. Sometimes we just need the right language to tell them." Sylvan realized he was holding his breath, afraid that any sound might break whatever spell had just been cast. His daughter, who had been disappearing into herself for months, had just emerged into something he didn't fully understand, but recognized as important. "Mrs. Corvain," he said quietly, "what just happened here?" She turned to him with eyes that sparkled with something between mischief and wisdom. "What happened, dear Sylvan, is that your daughter just had her first dance conversation. And I have a feeling she has quite a lot to say." The drive home was different. Instead of her usual silence, Arya peppered Sylvan with questions about Talise, about the photographs on her walls, about why someone would want to spend their whole life dancing. She sat straighter in her car seat, and her hands moved as she talked, tracing small patterns in the air as if she was still practicing the movements she'd learned. That night, after Arya had gone to bed, Sylvan found himself researching Talise Corvain on his laptop. What he discovered made him sit back in his kitchen chair, coffee growing cold beside him. Metropolitan Opera Ballet, principal dancer for 15 years. Reviews that used words like transcendent and otherworldly. Photographs from the New York Times. Archives showing a young woman whose grace seemed to emanate from some inner source of light. She hadn't just been a dancer. She'd been a star, which made what had happened that afternoon even more inexplicable. Why would someone of her caliber be interested in teaching movement to a shy 7-year-old in a nursing home room? What could she possibly gain from spending time with a grocery delivery man's daughter? The questions multiplied over the weekend. Arya asked twice if they could visit the dancing lady again, and both times Sylvan found himself hesitating. Not because he didn't want to. The transformation in his daughter had been remarkable, but because he didn't understand it. And things you didn't understand had a way of disappointing you. When you needed them most. Monday morning brought a phone call that deepened his confusion. "Mr. Marish?" The voice was professional, crisp. "This is Dr. Helena Vasquez, the director of Willowbrook Care Center. I was hoping we could schedule a time to speak about your visits with Mrs. Corvain." Sylvan's stomach dropped. "Is there a problem? Did I do something wrong?" "Did I do something wrong?" "Not wrong, exactly. Could you come in this afternoon? Say around 2 o'clock? The waiting was agony. Sylvan spent the morning imagining worst-case scenarios. Somehow he'd violated protocol, put Arya in danger, overstepped boundaries he didn't even know existed. By the time he arrived at Willowbrook, his nerves were stretched thin as wire. Dr. Vasquez's office was everything Talise's room wasn't: sterile, efficient, decorated with medical certificates and motivational posters about teamwork. She was a woman in her 50s with graying hair pulled back severely and the kind of professional demeanor that suggested she dealt with difficult conversations on a regular basis. "Please, sit down," she said, gesturing to a chair across from her desk. "I want to discuss your relationship with Mrs. Corvain and the incident with your daughter last Thursday." "Incident?" Sylvan's voice was sharper than he intended. "What kind of incident?" "Mr. Marish, I need you to understand that Willowbrook has very strict policies about interactions between residents and visitors, especially when young people are involved. We have liability concerns, safety protocols, professional boundaries that must be maintained." Sylvan felt heat rising in his chest. "Dr. Vasquez, with all due respect, what exactly are you suggesting? Mrs. Corvain showed my daughter some arm movements. They weren't even out of her wheelchair." "I'm not suggesting anything inappropriate occurred," Dr. Vasquez said carefully. "But I am concerned about the nature of these interactions. Mrs. Corvain has been with us for 2 years, and she's never shown interest in socializing with visitors before. She's generally quite isolated, preferring to keep to herself. This sudden engagement with your daughter raises questions." "Questions about what?" Dr. Vasquez opened a file on her desk. "Mrs. Corvain has a history of depression and social withdrawal since her admission. Her family rarely visits, a nephew in California who calls perhaps twice a year. She's refused to participate in our recreational activities, turned down offers of physical therapy, and generally seems to have given up on engaging with life here." She looked up at Sylvan. And then you appear with your daughter, and suddenly she's animated, requesting specific music, rearranging her furniture. It's concerning. Concerning that she's showing signs of life. Concerning that she might be developing an unhealthy attachment, Dr. Vasquez replied coolly. Mr. Maurice, you're not a trained therapist. Your daughter isn't receiving supervised care. What happens when Mrs. Corvain's expectations exceed what you can provide? What happens when your daughter loses interest, or when your delivery schedule changes? We've seen residents become severely depressed when informal relationships end abruptly. Sylvan stared at her, trying to process what he was hearing. So you're saying that because Mrs. Corvain seems happier, that's a problem? I'm saying that happiness built on unstable foundations often leads to greater disappointment. Mrs. Corvain is elderly, isolated, and possibly vulnerable to forming inappropriate emotional dependencies. Your daughter is a young person who may not understand the impact of her interactions on someone in Mrs. Corvain's position. The conversation was taking on a surreal quality. Sylvan found himself defending something he didn't fully understand against accusations that seemed to criminalize kindness itself. Dr. Vasquez, let me make sure I understand this correctly. You're concerned because an elderly woman who was depressed and withdrawn is now engaged and animated. You're worried because my daughter, who has been struggling with her own social difficulties, had a positive interaction with someone who showed her kindness and attention. And your solution is to prevent these interactions from continuing. My solution is to ensure that any ongoing relationship follows proper protocols. If Mrs. Corvain wants to work with young people, we can arrange for her to participate in our intergenerational programming, where trained staff can supervise interactions and ensure appropriate boundaries. Supervised interactions, Sylvan repeated slowly. With trained staff. Following protocols, exactly. Sylvan thought about Arya's face during that afternoon with Talise. The wonder. The engagement. The way she'd emerged from months of withdrawal into something that looked like joy. He thought about Talise's grace, her patience. The way she'd spoken to his daughter, not as a problem to be managed, but as a person worthy of attention and respect. And what does Mrs. Corvain think about these protocols? Dr. Vasquez's expression tightened slightly. Mrs. Corvain's preferences aren't the primary concern here. Our responsibility is to ensure the safety and well-being of all our residents, which sometimes means protecting them from their own impulses. Protecting them from their impulses to connect with other human beings. Mr. Maurice, I understand this may seem harsh, but institutional care requires institutional thinking. We can't make exceptions based on individual preferences or emotional responses. We have regulations, liability concerns, professional standards to maintain. Sylvan stood up slowly, his hands clenched at his sides. Dr. Vasquez, what you're describing sounds like a prison disguised as a care facility. You're telling me that an 83-year-old woman who spent her life bringing beauty into the world isn't allowed to share that gift with a 7-year-old girl who desperately needs to remember that beauty exists. I'm telling you that good intentions don't protect against liability, lawsuits, or regulatory violations. This conversation is a courtesy, Mr. Maurice. I could simply restrict Mrs. Corvain's visitor privileges or limit your access to the facility. The threat hung in the air between them like smoke. Sylvan realized he was facing a choice he'd never anticipated, between the institutional safety of following rules and the human risk of following his heart. And if I refuse to follow your protocols, then I'm afraid your delivery privileges would be terminated, and Mrs. Corvain would be restricted to family visits only. Dr. Vasquez's tone was matter-of-fact, as if she was discussing the weather. I hope you understand that this isn't personal. It's simply policy. Sylvan looked around the sterile office, at the certificates on the walls, at the woman across from him who seemed to have mistaken management for care. He thought about Arya asking when they could visit the dancing lady again, and about Tallis's eyes lighting up when they'd walked into her room. "I understand perfectly," he said quietly. "The question is whether understanding something makes it right." That evening, Sylvan sat at his kitchen table staring at the business card. Dr. Vasquez had given him contact information for the facility's structured recreational programming coordinator. The card felt like a small piece of bureaucracy designed to replace something that had felt. For one brief afternoon, like magic, Aria was in her room, and through the thin walls of their apartment, he could hear her moving around in ways that were different from her usual patterns. Instead of the quiet, careful movements of someone trying not to be noticed, there were sounds of experimentation, feet shuffling in rhythm, the soft whisper of arms moving through air. She was practicing. The realization hit him like a physical blow. His daughter was practicing dance movements she'd learned from an 83-year-old woman in a wheelchair, alone in her bedroom, because it was the first thing in months that had made her feel alive. And he was supposed to take that away from her because it didn't fit someone else's definition of appropriate. Sylvan pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found the number he was looking for. His sister Rachel answered on the second ring, her voice carrying the controlled chaos of someone managing 3 teenagers and a full-time job. "Sil? Everything okay? You never call during the week. I need to ask you something about Aria, about the divorce." There was a pause, and he could almost hear Rachel shifting gears from multitasking mode to focused attention. "What about it? You think I made the right decision? Fighting for custody?" "Sylvan, where is this coming from?" He leaned back in his chair, suddenly exhausted. "I'm just wondering if I'm enough. If I'm giving her what she needs." "Okay, hold on." Rachel's voice became muffled as she spoke to someone else, probably telling one of her kids to handle whatever crisis was unfolding in the background. "Sil, talk to me. What's going on?" So he told her about the grocery deliveries, about Tallis, about the afternoon when Aria had come alive in ways he hadn't seen since before the divorce, about Dr. Vasquez and protocols, and the choice he was facing between following rules and following his instincts. Rachel listened without interrupting, which was unlike her. When he finished, there was a long silence. "Sil," she said finally, "do you remember what Aria was like before Emma left?" The question caught him off guard. "What do you mean?" "I mean, do you remember who she was? Because I don't think you're seeing the whole picture here." Sylvan frowned. "She was a normal kid. Happy, outgoing." "No, she wasn't." Rachel's voice was gentle but firm. "Sil, Aria was already withdrawing before the divorce. She was already spending too much time alone, already having trouble connecting with other kids. Emma used to call me, worried because Aria would have meltdowns when plans changed, because she couldn't handle loud noises or crowded spaces." The words hit him like cold water. "That's not how I remember it. That's not how I remember it." "Because you weren't there," Rachel said softly. "You were deployed for 8 months when she was 5, remember? And then when you came back, you were dealing with the transition, trying to find work, figuring out civilian life. Emma was handling most of the day-to-day parenting." Sylvan felt something shift in his chest, a recognition of truths he'd been avoiding. "Are you saying the divorce wasn't what broke her?" "I'm saying maybe Aria was already struggling, and the divorce just made it more obvious. Maybe what you're seeing now, this engagement with the woman at the nursing home, maybe that's not about fixing something that got broken. Maybe it's about finally finding something that fits who she's always been." The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, but Sylvan found himself only half listening. Rachel's words had unlocked a series of memories he'd been avoiding. Emma's frustrated phone calls during his deployment, complaints about Aria's difficult phases, the relief in Emma's voice when she'd agreed to let him have primary custody. After he hung up, Sylvan walked quietly to Aria's bedroom door and listened. The sounds had stopped, but he could see light under the door. He knocked softly. "Come in," came her small voice. He found her sitting on her bed, still fully dressed, looking out her window at the parking lot below. Her arms were wrapped around her knees, and there was something in her posture that reminded him, suddenly, of Talise, that same quality of graceful containment, of holding something precious inside. "Hey kiddo, everything okay?" "Dad, why do some people live in places like where Talise lives?" Sylvan sat down on the edge of her bed, choosing his words carefully. "Sometimes people get older and need help taking care of themselves. Or sometimes they get sick or hurt, and they need more help than their families can give them. But Talise isn't sick. She just can't walk." "That's true. Sometimes people end up in those places for different reasons." Arya was quiet for a moment, then asked, "Do you think she's lonely?" The question pierced him. "What makes you ask that?" "When she was showing me the arm movements, she looked different. Like she was remembering something happy. But then when the music stopped, she looked sad again." Arya turned to face him. "I think she misses dancing." Sylvan studied his daughter's face, the seriousness in her dark eyes, the way she'd unconsciously adopted some of Talise's precise posture. "Arya, how did it feel when you were moving with her?" "Like I was talking, but not with words." She paused, searching for the right way to explain. "Like my arms knew things I didn't know I knew." "And you want to do it again?" "Yes, but not with other people watching. Just with her." There it was, the heart of the problem Dr. Vasquez couldn't see. Arya didn't need supervised recreational programming. She needed authentic connection. She needed someone who understood that some conversations happen best in silence, that some learning occurred not through instruction, but through recognition. "Dad, are we going to visit her again?" Sylvan looked at his daughter, really looked at her. At 7 years old, she was already learning to navigate a world that would consistently try to fit her into boxes that weren't designed for who she was. She'd spent the last year becoming smaller, quieter, more careful about taking up space or asking for what she needed. And now, for the first time in months, she was asking for something specific, something that had made her feel more like herself. "Yes," he said, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice. "We're going to visit her again, even if the doctor lady doesn't want us to." Sylvan thought about Dr. Vasquez's sterile office, about protocols designed to protect institutions rather than individuals, about the difference between safety and bureaucracy. "Sometimes, kiddo, the right thing and the allowed thing aren't the same thing. Will you get in trouble?" "Maybe, but some troubles are worth it." Arya nodded solemnly, as if this made perfect sense to her. "Dad, can I ask you something else?" "Of course." "Do you think Mom would have understood about the dancing?" The question hit him in a place he wasn't prepared for. Emma, who had valued predictability and conventional success. Emma, who had grown frustrated with Arya's quirks and sensitivities. Emma, who had ultimately chosen a life that didn't include the complications of a daughter who needed the world to be quieter, more patient, more accepting of different ways of being. "I think," Sylvan said carefully, "your mom loves you, but she doesn't always understand the same things we do. Like how sometimes you need to move your body to figure out what you're thinking." Exactly like that. Arya smiled, the first real smile he'd seen from her in weeks. "I'm glad you understand." As Sylvan tucked her in and turned out the light, he realized that understanding might be the most important gift he could give his daughter. Not the structured programming Dr. Vasquez recommended. Not the conventional solutions that worked for other families. But the willingness to see Arya for who she truly was and to fight for her right to be that person in a world that preferred conformity to authenticity. Tomorrow, he would call Dr. Vasquez and tell her that he and Arya would continue their visits with Talise. Not because he didn't understand the risks, but because he understood something more important. Sometimes, the greatest risk is playing it safe when someone you love needs you to be brave. Friday morning arrived with a phone call that changed everything. Sylvan was loading the delivery van when his phone buzzed with an unknown number. "Mr. Maurice? This is James Corvain, Talisa's nephew. I got your number from the nursing home. I think we need to talk." Sylvan's stomach dropped. "Is Mrs. Corvain okay?" "She's fine physically. But I got a call from Dr. Vasquez yesterday about your visits, and I'm flying in from San Francisco this weekend. I'd like to meet with you before I see my aunt." They arranged to meet at a coffee shop near Willowbrook Saturday morning. James Corvain turned out to be a man in his 50s with silver-rimmed glasses and the kind of expensive casual wear that suggested success in something corporate. He was already seated when Sylvan arrived, studying his phone with the focused attention of someone perpetually managing crises. "Mr. Maurice," James stood and extended his hand. "Thank you for meeting me on short notice." Sylvan shook his hand, noting the firm grip and the way James's eyes assessed him quickly, professionally. "Of course. Though I have to say, I'm not sure why you wanted to meet." James gestured for him to sit. "Dr. Vasquez called me because she's concerned about my aunt's recent behavior. Apparently, she's been more animated lately, making requests, showing interest in activities." He paused. "She seems to think this is related to your visits. And you think that's a problem?" "I think it's complicated." James folded his hands on the table. "Mr. Maurice, how much do you know about my aunt's history?" Sylvan chose his words carefully. "I know she was a dancer. A very accomplished one. She was more than accomplished. She was extraordinary. For 15 years, she was one of the most celebrated ballerinas in the country. Critics called her performances transcendent. She had a gift that maybe one person in a generation possesses." James's voice carried a mixture of pride and something else, regret perhaps. "And then it all ended." She mentioned an injury. A torn Achilles tendon during a performance of Swan Lake. She was 45, which was already pushing the limits for a principal dancer. The injury healed, but not completely. Her dancing career was over. James picked up his coffee cup but didn't drink. "Do you know what that kind of loss does to someone whose entire identity was built around movement?" Sylvan thought about Arya's question the night before, whether Talis was lonely. "I imagine it would be devastating." It was. She tried teaching for a while, ran a small dance academy in the city. But even that became too painful, watching young dancers achieve what she could no longer do. So she withdrew. Sold the academy, moved to a small apartment, essentially disappeared from the dance world entirely. And then she came to Willowbrook. After her husband died 3 years ago, yes. She'd been caring for him through his illness, and afterward, she just seemed to give up. Her health declined rapidly, not because of any specific medical condition, but because she'd lost the will to engage with life. James finally took a sip of his coffee. "Mr. Maurice, for the past 2 years, my aunt has been a ghost of herself. She barely speaks to the staff, refuses visitors, shows no interest in anything. The woman who once commanded stages now spends her days staring out a window." Sylvan felt a chill of understanding. "Until Thursday. Until Thursday. Dr. Vasquez tells me that after your visit, my aunt requested specific music, rearranged her furniture, and has been asking about when you and your daughter might return. For someone who hasn't shown interest in anything for 2 years, this represents a dramatic shift. You sound like you think that's a bad thing." James was quiet for a moment, studying Sylvan's face. "Mr. Maurice, what do you do for work?" "Besides the grocery deliveries, I'm between jobs right now. Looking for something in logistics or supply chain management." "Military background?" 5 years, yeah. Why?" "Dr. Vasquez mentioned that. She also mentioned that you're a single father, recently divorced, struggling financially." James's tone wasn't unkind, but it was direct. "She's concerned that you might not understand the complexity of my aunt's emotional state. complexity of my aunt's emotional state. Sylvan felt heat rising in his chest. And what complexity is that? The complexity of someone who has lost everything that gave their life meaning, trying to reclaim it through a connection that can't possibly sustain itself. James leaned forward. Mr. Maurice, my aunt was a professional performer. She understands drama, emotion, the power of creating moments that feel magical. But what happens when the performance ends? This isn't a performance, isn't it? An accomplished former ballerina, confined to a wheelchair, discovers a shy young girl and begins teaching her movement. It's a beautiful story, but stories have endings. What happens when your daughter loses interest? What happens when your delivery schedule changes, or you find other work, or your life moves in a different direction? Sylvan stared at him. You think I'm going to abandon your aunt? I think you're a well-meaning person who may not realize the emotional stakes involved. My aunt has spent the last 20 years learning to live with loss. If she allows herself to hope again, to invest emotionally in something that isn't permanent, the disappointment could be catastrophic. So your solution is to prevent her from hoping at all. My solution is to protect her from unnecessary pain. James pulled out his phone and showed Sylvan a photograph. Talise as a young woman. Radiant in costume, arms extended in what looked like flight. This woman gave everything to her art. When she lost the ability to dance, she lost her sense of self. When her husband died, she lost her anchor to the world. I won't let her go through that kind of loss again, because a grocery delivery man thought his daughter might benefit from informal dance lessons. The words hit like a slap. Sylvan felt his military training kick in, the ability to stay calm under fire, to think tactically even when emotions ran high. Mr. Corvain, with respect, you're talking about your aunt like she's a fragile ornament instead of a human, being capable of making her own choices. I'm talking about her like someone who has already been broken too many times, and I'm talking about her like someone who might have something to offer the world beyond being protected from it. Sylvan's voice was rising, despite his efforts to stay calm. Your aunt spent an hour with my daughter and accomplished something that months of therapy couldn't. She helped a struggling kid find a way to express herself that didn't depend on words or conventional social skills. And what happens when that help isn't available anymore? Then at least my daughter will have learned that such help exists, that there are people in the world who understand different ways of being, who can see past surface appearances to recognize what someone needs. Sylvan stood up, suddenly feeling claustrophobic in the small coffee shop. Mr. Corvain, you're so focused on protecting your aunt from disappointment that you're guaranteeing her despair. James remained seated, his expression unchanged. Mr. Maurice, I've arranged for my aunt to be transferred to a facility in California, closer to where I live. It's a better place, more resources, specialized care, activities designed for people with her background. The world seemed to tilt. You're moving her. I'm giving her a chance at a more structured, sustainable form of engagement. Professional therapeutic recreation, supervised interactions with trained staff. A community of people with similar backgrounds and interests. When? Next week. The transfer is already arranged. Sylvan felt something break inside his chest. Does she know? I'm telling her tomorrow. Mr. Maurice, I know this seems harsh, but it's for the best. My aunt needs professional care, not the emotional complications of informal relationships that can't be sustained. Have you asked her what she needs? I'm her legal guardian. I make decisions based on what's best for her long-term welfare. Sylvan looked at this man, successful, well-intentioned, completely missing the point. Mr. Corvain, what if what's best for your aunt isn't safety? What if it's the chance to matter again, to use what she knows to help someone who needs it? James stood as well, pulling out his wallet. Mr. Maurice, I appreciate your concern for my aunt. But some risks aren't worth taking, especially when the stakes are someone's remaining years of emotional stability. As James left money on the table and walked away, Sylvan remained standing in the coffee shop, surrounded by the ordinary sounds of Saturday morning: espresso machines, casual conversation, the rustle of newspapers. Normal people living normal lives, unaware that somewhere across town, an 83-year-old woman was about to lose the first thing that had given her joy in years. He thought about Aria, practicing dance movements alone in her bedroom. He thought about Talisa's face when the music played, the way she'd transformed from an elderly resident into something timeless and alive. He thought about all the ways the world conspired to separate people who needed each other, always in the name of safety, always with the best intentions. And then he pulled out his phone and called the one person who might understand what was really at stake. "Rachel, it's me. I need your help with something, and I need you to not ask questions until I'm done explaining." Sunday morning came too soon, and not soon enough. Sylvan had barely slept, his mind churning through scenarios and possibilities, each one seeming more impossible than the last. Rachel had listened to his entire story the night before, asking pointed questions that forced him to examine his motivations and consider consequences he hadn't anticipated. "You sure about this?" she'd asked finally. "Because once you cross this line, there's no going back to being just the grocery delivery guy." "I crossed that line the moment I saw my daughter come alive for the first time in months," he'd replied. Now, standing outside Willowbrook at 7 in the morning with Aria beside him, that certainty felt more fragile. They weren't supposed to be here this early. But Sylvan had called ahead and spoken to the weekend nurse, explaining that they needed to see Mrs. Corvain before her nephew arrived. Aria had been unusually quiet during the drive, her small hands folded in her lap, her expression serious in a way that suggested she understood more about the situation than he'd explained to her. "Dad," she said as they approached the entrance, "is Talis going away?" Sylvan stopped walking and knelt down to her level. "Her nephew wants to move her to a different place, yes." "Because of us?" The question pierced him. "Not because of anything you did wrong, sweetheart. Because some people think it's safer to keep people apart than to let them care about each other." Aria considered this with the gravity she brought to all complex problems. "But if she goes away, who will she dance with?" "I don't know, kiddo. And who will help me learn the arm stories?" Sylvan felt his chest tighten. "Maybe we can find someone else who understands about moving and music." Aria shook her head firmly. "It won't be the same. Talis knows things other people don't know." They found Talis in her room, positioned by the window but not looking out. Instead, she was staring at her hands, which lay motionless in her lap. The record player was silent, and the photographs on the walls seemed somehow dimmed, as if the life had gone out of them. She looked up when they entered, and Sylvan saw something in her expression that made his heart sink. She already knew. "My dear ones," she said softly, "I wasn't expecting you today." "We wanted to see you," Aria said, walking directly to Talisa's wheelchair and taking one of her hands. "Are you sad?" Talis's composure wavered for just a moment. "A little, yes. Because you have to go to the new place?" "Because I have to leave friends I've just found." Sylvan moved closer, noting how Talisa's room already looked different, less personal, as if she'd begun the emotional process of detaching from the space. "Mrs. Corvain, when did you find out?" "James visited yesterday evening. He's a good man, you understand. He loves me and wants what's best." Her voice carried the careful neutrality of someone who had learned not to fight battles they couldn't win. "The new facility has wonderful programs," he says. "Art therapy, music groups, other residents with performance backgrounds." "But you don't want to go," Aria said. It wasn't a question. Talis looked down at the young girl holding her hand. "Want is a complicated thing when you're my age, dear one. Sometimes what we want and what's possible aren't the same thing. But what if they could be?" Sylvan found himself saying, "What if there was another way?" Talas's eyes sharpened, focusing on him with sudden intensity. "What do you mean?" Sylvan took a deep breath. What he was about to suggest would change everything, for all of them. But looking at Arya's serious face and Talas's carefully contained hope, he realized that some changes were worth the risk. What if you didn't have to choose between leaving and staying isolated? What if there was a third option? "Sylvan," Talas said carefully, "I don't understand. What if you could teach? Really teach, not just informal conversations in your room? What if there were other young people like Arya who could benefit from what you know?" Talas was very still. "That's a beautiful thought, but I'm in a wheelchair in a nursing home. I'm not exactly positioned to start a dance academy." "Maybe not a traditional one," Sylvan said, his mind racing as the idea took shape. "But what about something different? Something that meets people where they are, instead of requiring them to fit into existing structures?" Arya had been listening with the focused attention she brought to things that mattered to her. Now she spoke up. "Like teaching the arm stories to other kids who don't like to talk much." "Exactly like that," Sylvan said, looking at his daughter with newfound respect for her insight. "Mrs. Corvain, there are probably dozens of young people in this area who struggle with traditional forms of expression, who might benefit from learning that movement can be a language. And dozens of elderly residents in places like this who have knowledge and skills they're never asked to share," Talas added slowly, her voice gaining strength as she spoke. "Musicians who can't hold instruments anymore but remember every note. Artists whose hands shake but whose eyes still see composition and color." Sylvan felt the energy in the room shift as the idea gained momentum. What if we created something that brought them together? Not a program imposed from above, but something organic, based on actual connections between people who have something to offer each other. Talas was quiet for a long moment, her fingers moving in small patterns against the arm of her wheelchair, the muscle memory of choreography asserting itself as her mind worked. It would take resources. Space, equipment, liability insurance. And it would need to be legitimate, officially recognized, not just informal visits that could be shut down by administrative concerns. "I have some ideas about that," Sylvan said. "My sister works in nonprofit development. She's been helping me research what it would take to establish something like this legally. You've already looked into this?" "I started yesterday after I met with James, Mrs. Corvain. I realized that the problem isn't just about you and Arya. It's bigger than that. There are regulatory systems in place that prioritize safety over connection, that protect institutions rather than individuals. But what if we worked within those systems to create something different?" Talas leaned forward in her wheelchair, and for the first time since they'd arrived, she looked fully present. "Tell me more." Sylvan pulled out his phone and opened the notes he'd been compiling. A non-profit organization focused on intergenerational artistic exchange. Seniors with professional backgrounds in the arts paired with young people who learn differently or struggle with conventional forms of expression. Structured enough to meet regulatory requirements, but flexible enough to allow for authentic relationships. And where would this happen? Initially, in facilities like this one, with proper permissions and oversight. Eventually, maybe in community centers, libraries, schools that are open to alternative approaches. Sylvan looked around Talas's room. But it would start here, with you and Arya and any other residents or young people who might benefit. Arya had been listening with growing excitement. "Talas, would you teach other kids the arm stories?" "If their parents wanted me to, and if the administration approved, yes." Talas's voice was stronger now, carrying echoes of the authority she'd once wielded in rehearsal studios and on stages. "But Arya, it wouldn't just be me teaching. You would be teaching too, showing other young people that there are different ways to communicate, different ways to be in the world. I could do that?" "You already are doing that, dear one. Every time you move with intention, Every time you respond to music with your body instead of words, you're demonstrating possibilities that other people might not know exist. Sylvan watched his daughter process this idea, that she could be not just a recipient of help, but a source of it. The transformation in her posture was immediate and profound. She stood straighter, her eyes brighter, as if someone had just told her she was exactly who the world needed her to be. There would be challenges, Tallis continued, now fully engaged with the possibility. James would need to be convinced. Dr. Vasquez would need to approve any programming. We'd need to demonstrate that this approach has value beyond individual preference. But it's possible? It's more than possible, Tully said. And for the first time since they'd known her, her voice carried the full authority of someone who had spent decades making impossible things happen through discipline, vision, and sheer force of will. It's necessary. As if summoned by their conversation, there was a knock at the door. James Corvain entered, carrying flowers and wearing the expression of someone prepared for a difficult conversation. He stopped short when he saw Sylvan and Aria. "I wasn't expecting visitors," he said carefully. "James," Tullis said, her voice calm but firm, "I'd like you to meet the people who've given me a reason to stay." The silence that followed Tully's words felt like the moment before lightning strikes, charged with potential energy and the certainty that everything was about to change dramatically. James Corvain stood in the doorway, flowers in one hand, his expression cycling through surprise, confusion, and something that might have been alarm. "Aunt Tallis," he said carefully, setting the flowers on her bedside table, "we discussed this yesterday. The arrangements have been made, and now I'm asking you to unmake them," Tallis replied with quiet dignity. "I've been presented with an alternative that I'd like to explore." James's gaze shifted to Sylvan, and his expression hardened. "Mr. Maurice, I thought I made it clear yesterday that these informal visits needed to end." "You did," Sylvan said, standing up. "But you also made it clear that you were concerned about your aunt's emotional well-being and her need for meaningful engagement. What we're proposing addresses those concerns in a more sustainable way." "What you're proposing?" James's voice rose slightly. "Mr. Maurice, you're a grocery delivery driver. You have no background in elder care, therapeutic recreation, or program development. What exactly are you proposing?" Aria had moved closer to Tallis's wheelchair during this exchange, her small hand resting protectively on the armrest. Now she spoke up, her voice quiet but clear. "We're proposing that Tallis gets to teach again." James looked down at her as if noticing her for the first time. "Sweetheart, it's not that simple. Teaching requires facilities, insurance, qualified supervision, all of which can be arranged," Sylvan interrupted, "through proper channels with appropriate oversight and professional structure." "In how much time?" James asked sharply. "The transfer to California is scheduled for Wednesday. The facility there is expecting her. Her room is prepared, and the medical transport has been arranged." "Then we have 3 days," Tully said calmly. James stared at his aunt. 3 days to what? Create an entire program from nothing? Obtain regulatory approval? Convince the administration here to completely reverse their position on visitor protocols? 3 days to demonstrate that what we're proposing has merit, Sylvan said. "James, what if I could show you that this isn't just wishful thinking? What if there are other residents here who would benefit from what your aunt has to offer? Other families dealing with issues similar to mine." "You've been talking to other residents?" "I've been observing," Sylvan said carefully. "And what I see is a facility full of people with decades of knowledge and experience, who are treated like patients instead of resources. Your aunt isn't the only former professional here. There's a retired music teacher in room 184, who sits alone every day despite having taught hundreds of students. A former art professor in 221, whose family photos show gallery exhibitions, but who never touches a paintbrush anymore. James looked skeptical. And you think they want to start teaching again? I think they want to matter again, Tullis said softly. James, do you know what the worst part of being here is? It's not the physical limitations or the institutional food or even the loss of independence. It's the feeling that everything valuable about who you were has been filed away as irrelevant history. But Aunt, you've shown no interest in the programs they have here. Because their programs treat me like a recipient of services, instead of someone who has something to give. Tullis's voice carried a hint of the steel that had once driven her to excellence on the world's most demanding stages. James, I spent 40 years of my life teaching people to find their voices through movement. Do you really think that knowledge dies just because my legs don't work anymore? James was quiet for a moment, his expression troubled. Aunt Tullis, I'm not questioning your abilities or your knowledge. I'm questioning whether this facility, this community, can provide the kind of support structure you'd need to do what you're suggesting safely and sustainably. Then let us prove it can, Sylvan said. Give us 3 days to demonstrate that this has potential beyond our personal situation. And if you can't? Sylvan looked at Arya, who was watching the conversation with the intensity of someone whose world hung in the balance. Then we'll accept that the California facility is the best option and we'll find other ways to support what your aunt started with my daughter. James pulled out his phone and scrolled through what looked like a complex schedule. The medical transport can't be postponed without significant cost and rescheduling complications. I'll cover any cancellation fees, Sylvan said quickly. You'll cover them? James looked at him skeptically. Mr. Maurice, do you have any idea what specialized medical transport costs? Sylvan didn't, but he'd figure it out. Whatever it costs, I'll handle it. With what money? You're working grocery delivery to make ends meet. Grocery delivery to make ends meet. The question hung in the air, exposing the fundamental inequality in their situation. James had resources, connections, the ability to make decisions and implement them quickly. Sylvan had good intentions and 3 days to prove that sometimes good intentions could be enough. I'll find a way, Sylvan said simply. Arya tugged on Tullis's sleeve. What if we showed him? She asked. What if we showed him what the teaching looks like? Tullis looked down at her with surprise and growing admiration. What do you mean, dear one? You could teach me something new right now, and Uncle James could see how it works. Arya looked at James with the serious expression she wore when solving complex problems. If he sees that it's real, maybe he'll understand why it matters. James started to protest. Sweetheart, this isn't really something that can be demonstrated in a few minutes, but Tullis had already begun moving her wheelchair into position. Actually, James, I think Arya has an excellent point. Movement speaks more clearly than words, and you've never seen what we do together. Aunt Tullis, this isn't necessary. It's completely necessary, she said with the kind of quiet authority that brooked no argument. Arya, would you like to show your Uncle James how we have conversations without words? Arya nodded and moved to stand beside Tullis's wheelchair. Without being asked, Sylvan found the small Bluetooth speaker and pulled up the music app on his phone. He selected one of the pieces Tullis had been using, a gentle piano composition that seemed to invite movement rather than demand it. As the music began, Tullis raised her arms, and immediately the sterile nursing home room transformed into something else entirely. Her movements were precise, economical, but they carried decades of training and experience. She wasn't just moving her arms. She was creating a vocabulary of gesture that spoke of longing, hope, the search for connection across vast distances. Arya watched for a moment, then began to respond. Her movements were different from Tullis's, less trained but equally expressive, full of the intuitive grace that comes from feeling rather than thinking. Together, they created a conversation that needed no words. A dialogue between generations that spoke to something fundamental about human connection and the ways We reach for each other across the gaps that separate us. James watched in complete silence, his expression shifting from skepticism to something approaching wonder. This wasn't the informal activity he'd been imagining. This was art happening in real time, created by an 83-year-old woman in a wheelchair and a 7-year-old girl who had found her voice through movement. When the music ended and they lowered their arms, the silence that followed felt sacred rather than empty. "That," James said quietly, "was not what I was expecting." "Uncle James," Arya said, still breathing slightly hard from the exertion. "Do you see why other kids might want to learn this? Do you see why Talise needs to stay?" James looked at his aunt, then at Sylvan, then back at Arya. "I see why this matters to you. But I also see why it scares me." "What scares you about it?" Tallis asked gently. "The possibility that it might not work out," James said honestly. "And what that disappointment might do to you." Monday morning brought the kind of clarity that only comes after sleepless nights spent wrestling with impossible decisions. Sylvan had spent hours on his laptop, researching nonprofit incorporation, liability insurance, program development grants, and the maze of regulations governing activities in care facilities. What he'd learned was both encouraging and daunting, possible, but complex enough to require expertise he didn't possess. By 6 a.m., he was on the phone with Rachel. "I need you to tell me honestly," he said without preamble. "Am I completely out of my mind?" "Probably," Rachel replied, her voice thick with sleep. "But that doesn't mean you're wrong." "Sil, I've been thinking about this all night. What you're proposing isn't just about Arya and this woman. It's about creating something that could help a lot of people. But can it actually be done? In 3 days? Not completely, no. But you might be able to do enough to demonstrate viability. I made some calls yesterday after we talked. I have a contact at the State Department of Aging who might be able to provide some guidance on regulatory requirements. And there's a foundation that specifically funds intergenerational programming initiatives." Sylvan felt a flicker of hope. "Are you saying this is actually possible?" "I'm saying it's worth fighting for. But Sil, you need to understand what you're taking on. If this works, if you actually manage to create something sustainable, it's going to become your life. You can't start a nonprofit as a side project while you look for work in logistics." The weight of that realization settled over him. He looked around his small apartment, at the stack of bills on his kitchen table, at the job applications he'd been meaning to complete. "Rachel, I can't afford to not work. But can you afford to give up the first thing that's made Arya come alive in months? Can you afford to let an 83-year-old woman with decades of knowledge disappear into institutional anonymity because it's easier than fighting for something different?" The question hung between them, carrying implications that extended far beyond practical considerations. This wasn't just about money or career stability. It was about what kind of person he wanted to be, what kind of father, what kind of human being who encountered suffering and had the opportunity to do something about it. "Tell me what I need to do," he said. 2 hours later, Sylvan sat in Dr. Vasquez's office for the second time in a week, but this time he wasn't alone. Rachel had driven down from Springfield and sat beside him, a folder of documents in her lap and the kind of professional composure that came from years of navigating bureaucratic systems. Across from them, Dr. Vasquez looked like someone who had been presented with a problem she hadn't anticipated and wasn't sure how to solve. "Mr. Maurice," she began, "I have to say, this is highly irregular. You're proposing to create an entirely new program at our facility with less than a week's notice. We're proposing to pilot a program that addresses documented needs in both your resident population and the broader community," Rachel corrected smoothly. "The research on intergenerational programming shows significant benefits for cognitive function, emotional well-being, and sense of purpose among elderly participants. while providing unique learning opportunities for young people who may not thrive in traditional educational settings. Dr. Vasquez glanced at the documents Rachel had provided. And you believe this can be implemented within our existing regulatory framework? With proper supervision and appropriate safeguards, yes. We're not proposing anything experimental or risky. Intergenerational arts programming is well established in facilities across the country. Rachel leaned forward slightly. Dr. Vasquez, what we're really proposing is a way to utilize the incredible resources. You already have residents with decades of professional experience who could benefit from the opportunity to share their knowledge in structured, meaningful ways, and the liability concerns would be addressed through proper program structure, insurance coverage, and adherence to state guidelines for activities in care facilities. Rachel pulled out another document. I've outlined the basic requirements here. Nothing that would be difficult to implement with adequate planning. Sylvan watched Dr. Vasquez read through the materials, noting the way her expression shifted from skepticism to cautious interest. This was what professional presentation looked like, he realized. This was how you turned passionate impulses into actionable proposals. Dr. Vasquez, he said, I know this seems sudden, but the need isn't sudden. Your residents have been sitting here with untapped knowledge and abilities for months, years in some cases. Young people in this community have been struggling with traditional approaches to learning and expression without knowing that alternatives exist. What we're proposing is just formalizing connections that should have been happening all along. And if the program doesn't work, if residents become frustrated, or young people lose interest, or parents raise concerns about unconventional methods, then we evaluate, adjust, and improve, Rachel said calmly. Dr. Vasquez, no program succeeds without challenges and refinements. But the potential benefits here, for residents, for young people, for families struggling with issues similar to Mr. Morris's, those benefits justify the effort required to address challenges as they arise. Dr. Vasquez was quiet for a long moment, her fingers drumming against her desk in a rhythm that reminded Sylvan suddenly of Aria's nervous habits. Mr. Morris, why is this so important to you? You could find other solutions for your daughter, private tutoring, specialized therapies, other activities that might meet her needs. Sylvan thought about Aria's face when she'd first moved with Talis, about the way she'd asked if other kids might want to learn arm stories, about the possibility that his shy, struggling daughter might not be broken, but simply different in ways that required different approaches. Because my daughter taught me something last week, he said finally. She taught me that what we call problems might actually be gifts that haven't found the right context yet. Dr. Vasquez. Aria's sensitivity to noise and crowds, her preference for nonverbal communication, her difficulty with conventional social interactions, in most settings, those are seen as deficits. But with Mrs. Corvain, they became advantages. They made her more attuned to movement, more responsive to nonverbal cues, more capable of learning through observation and intuition. And you think other young people might have similar experiences? I think there are probably dozens of young people in this area who've been told they're not good at things when they're actually good at different things. And I think there are residents in this facility who've been told their knowledge is no longer relevant when it's actually exactly what some of these young people need. Dr. Vasquez looked again at the documents Rachel had prepared, then at Sylvan, then out her window at the courtyard where residents sat in wheelchairs, mostly alone, watching the world happen around them rather than participating in it. What exactly are you asking from me? Permission to pilot the program for 1 month, Rachel said. Structured programming, proper supervision, documented outcomes, regular evaluation. If it works, we expand it. If it doesn't, we end it without having disrupted your existing operations. And Mrs. Corvain's transfer to California would be postponed pending the outcome of the pilot, Sylvan said. James has agreed to give us the month if you approve the program. This wasn't entirely true. James had agreed to consider postponing the transfer if they could demonstrate that what they were proposing had genuine merit and proper oversight. But Sylvan had learned that sometimes you had to speak with confidence about outcomes that weren't yet certain. Dr. Vasquez stood up and walked to her window, looking out at the courtyard. Mr. Maurice, if I approve this, if we move forward with your pilot program, you understand that failure isn't just disappointment. It's public failure. It's residents who might feel rejected or abandoned. It's families who trusted us to try something different and were let down. Yes, Sylvan said simply. I understand. And you're willing to take responsibility for that risk? Sylvan thought about Arya practicing dance movements alone in her bedroom. About Talas's transformation from withdrawn resident to engaged teacher. About all the connections that weren't happening because institutional safety had been prioritized over human possibility. I'm willing to take responsibility for the risk of not trying, he said. Dr. Vasquez, the biggest risk isn't that this program might fail. The biggest risk is that it might work, and we'll realize how many opportunities we've been missing all along. Dr. Vasquez turned back to face them, her expression unreadable. I'll need to discuss this with our board of directors. And I'll need guarantees about insurance, supervision, and program structure. You'll have them, Rachel said confidently. And Mr. Maurice, you'll need to understand that if this moves forward, you're no longer just a visitor or even a volunteer. You're taking on responsibility for something that affects the lives and well-being of vulnerable people. I understand, Sylvan said, and realized that he did. Completely and without reservation. Then let's see what we can build in the next month. 3 weeks later, the east wing of Willowbrook Care Center had been transformed in ways both subtle and profound. The sterile institutional atmosphere remained, but it was now punctuated by sounds that spoke of life being actively lived rather than simply maintained. The gentle percussion of a retired music teacher's fingers against a wheelchair tray as he kept time for a young boy learning rhythm. The soft rustle of fabric as a former seamstress guided a teenager through the meditative movements of textile arts. And from room 237, the familiar strains of classical music, accompanying what had become known throughout the facility as Talis's movement. Conversations. Sylvan stood in the hallway outside the newly designated program room, watching through the open doorway as Talis worked with a group of 5 young people, ranging in age from 6 to 14. Each had been referred by parents who had heard about the program through word of mouth, whispered conversations at school pickup, tentative inquiries to pediatricians, desperate phone calls from families who had exhausted conventional options for children who learned differently, felt differently, moved through the world differently. Arya was no longer the only participant, but she had become something unexpected and wonderful, a bridge between the adult world of structured programming and the intuitive world of young people discovering their own forms of expression. At 7, she had somehow become the group's unofficial translator, the one who could explain to newcomers what it felt like to let your arms tell stories, who could demonstrate that moving awkwardly was better than not moving at all. She's remarkable, said Dr. Patricia Chun, the program evaluator who had been documenting outcomes for the past 2 weeks. Your daughter has what we call natural pedagogical instincts. She teaches without realizing she's teaching. Sylvan watched Arya guide a new participant, a 9-year-old named Marcus who had been struggling with anxiety severe enough to cause physical symptoms. How do you mean? Watch how she approaches him. She doesn't tell him what to do or demonstrate correct technique. She simply starts moving in a way that invites response rather than demands it. She creates space for him to experiment without fear of judgment. Dr. Chun was right. Arya had positioned herself where Marcus could see her easily, and she was moving slowly, deliberately. Her arms tracing patterns that seemed to say, This is one possibility, but you might find another. When Marcus tentatively raised one hand, then lowered it quickly, Aria didn't encourage or correct. She simply continued her own movement, creating a rhythm he could join when ready. The remarkable thing, Dr. Chun continued, is that Mrs. Corvain has adapted her teaching methods to incorporate Aria's intuitive approach. Traditional dance instruction is often about precision, correction, achieving specific positions. But what they're doing here is more like collaborative exploration. As if to illustrate her point, Talissa's voice carried from the room, and encouraging. Beautiful, Marcus. Your hands are finding their own way to express what you're feeling. There's no wrong way to respond to music that speaks to you. Marcus's mother, Lisa, stood beside Sylvan and Dr. Chun, tears streaming down her cheeks. He hasn't spoken to anyone outside our immediate family in 6 months, she said quietly. His anxiety got so severe that we were homeschooling him because he couldn't handle the classroom environment. But look at him. Marcus was indeed transformed. His usual rigid posture had softened. His hands were moving with increasing confidence, and most remarkably, he was making eye contact with Talise and occasionally with Aria, not speaking yet, but present in a way that suggested speech might eventually follow. Mrs. Patterson, Dr. Chun said, addressing Lisa by her married name, what changes have you noticed at home? He's been practicing. In his room, in the backyard, when he thinks no one is watching. And yesterday, he asked me if I thought other kids felt scared the same way he does. It was the first time he's acknowledged that other people exist in his world in months. The session ended with what had become their signature closing, all participants and Talis forming a circle, arms extended toward the center, moving in a slow, synchronized breathing pattern that grounded everyone before returning to the outside world. It was Aria who had suggested this ritual, explaining that it helps everyone remember they're connected even when they go to different places. As families began collecting their young people, Sylvan noticed James Corvain entering the facility. His weekly visits had become routine, but his attitude toward the program had evolved from suspicious tolerance to grudging admiration to something approaching advocacy. How are our artists today? James asked, joining the group of observers. Incredible as always, Lisa replied. James, I can't thank you enough for giving this program a chance. Marcus has made more progress in 3 weeks than we saw in months of traditional therapy. James nodded, but Sylvan could see the complexity in his expression. The program's success had created an unexpected problem. It was working so well that demand was growing faster than they could accommodate. They now had a waiting list of 15 families, and 3 other care facilities in the region had inquired about implementing similar programs. Dr. Chun, James said, what does your evaluation report conclude? That this program represents a significant innovation in both elder care and alternative education approaches, she replied without hesitation. The participants are showing measurable improvements in emotional regulation, social engagement, and self-expression. The resident participants report increased sense of purpose and life satisfaction. And the intergenerational component is creating benefits that neither age group would experience in isolation. Meaning that Mrs. Corvain isn't just helping young people learn movement and self-expression. The young people are helping her rediscover aspects of her identity and purpose that had been dormant. It's genuinely mutual benefit, not charity disguised as programming. Charity disguised as programming. Talis emerged from the program room, her face flushed with the kind of exhaustion that comes from meaningful work rather than mere activity. At 83, she was working harder than she had in years. But she looked more vital than when Sylvan had first met her 6 months ago. James, she said, moving her wheelchair toward them, we need to discuss expansion. At Talis, I know the program is successful, but nothing. We have families driving 45 minutes each way to participate. We have young people on waiting lists who need what we're offering. And we have residents in this facility and others who are watching what we're doing and asking why they can't be involved. James looked around the group. Sylvan, Dr. Chun, Lisa, several other parents who had lingered to observe. What exactly are you proposing? I'm proposing that we stop thinking small, Tallis said with the authority of someone who had once commanded international stages. This isn't just a nice program for one facility. It's a model that could be replicated anywhere there are elderly people with skills and young people who need different approaches to learning. Sylvan felt his pulse quicken. Over the past month, he had transitioned from grocery delivery driver to program coordinator almost without noticing. The work was demanding, often frustrating, occasionally overwhelming, but it was also the first thing he had done since leaving the military that felt like a true calling rather than just a job. The funding would be the biggest challenge, he said. We're currently operating on grants and donations, but expansion would require significant capital. Actually, Dr. Chun interjected. I've been approached by 2 foundations that are interested in providing substantial funding for program replication. The preliminary results here are generating attention in academic and policy circles. James looked skeptical. How substantial? Substantial enough to establish programs in 10 facilities across 3 states over the next 2 years, with proper evaluation and documentation to support further expansion. The weight of possibility settled over the group. What had begun as a desperate attempt to prevent one elderly woman from being moved away from one struggling family had somehow evolved into something with the potential to impact hundreds of lives. There would be challenges, James said carefully. Quality control, training standards, ensuring that replication doesn't dilute what makes this program effective. All manageable with proper planning and oversight, Tallis replied. James, I spent 15 years performing for audiences who expected perfection every night. I understand the importance of maintaining standards while scaling operations. Arya appeared at Sylvan's side, having finished helping clean up the program room. Dad, Marcus asked if I could teach him the arm stories we learned first. Is that okay? Sylvan knelt down to her level. What do you think, sweetheart? Do you feel ready to be a teacher? I think I've been a teacher for a while, she said with the matter-of-fact wisdom that had become characteristic of her transformed confidence. I just didn't know that's what it was called. Looking at his daughter, poised, articulate, comfortable in her own skin in ways that would have been unimaginable 6 months ago, Sylvan realized that the program's greatest success wasn't measurable in evaluation reports or funding proposals. It was in the simple fact that a shy, withdrawn 7-year-old now understood herself as someone with gifts to share rather than deficits to overcome. Then yes, he said. I think you're ready to be whatever kind of teacher you want to be. 5 years later, I stand in the main performance space of the Corvain Center for Intergenerational Arts, watching my daughter Arya lead a workshop for new program participants. At 12, she moves with the unconscious grace that comes from years of understanding her body as an instrument of expression rather than a source of anxiety. Her students, ranging from age 5 to 15, follow her movements with the kind of attention that only happens when someone is teaching from authentic experience rather than curriculum requirements. Remember, Arya says, her voice carrying the patient authority she inherited from Tallis. There's no wrong way to respond to what you're feeling. Your arms know things your mind hasn't figured out yet. I'm Sylvan Marish, now the executive director of a nonprofit that operates intergenerational arts programs in 43 facilities across 8 states. What began as a desperate attempt to save one relationship has become a movement that has documented outcomes for over 2,000 participants, influenced policy discussions about aging and alternative education, and created a model that's being studied internationally. But numbers, impressive as they might be, don't capture what really matters about this work. What matters is Marcus, now 14. who speaks confidently to groups of adults about his experience with anxiety and the role movement played in his recovery. He's become an advocate for young people who learn differently, testifying at state hearings about the need for alternative approaches in educational settings. What matters is Eleanor Vance, the retired music teacher from room 184, who now coordinates our rhythm and percussion programming. At 79, she's busier than she was at 40, working with young people who struggle with attention and impulse control, helping them find focus through the structured freedom of musical expression. What matters is the transformation that happens every time a withdrawn elderly person discovers they still have something valuable to offer, and every time a struggling young person realizes that their differences might be strengths in disguise. Tallis sits in her wheelchair at the front of today's session, now 88, but still commanding attention with the same presence that once filled theaters. Age has slowed her movements but somehow concentrated their power. When she raises her arms, the room falls silent, not from obedience, but from recognition that something meaningful is about to happen. Today, she announces, we're going to explore what it means to dance with gravity instead of against it. The metaphor isn't accidental. Everything about our program philosophy centers on working with rather than against the realities of human difference, aging, limitation, and need. Traditional approaches often focus on overcoming deficits, achieving normative behaviors, or maintaining previous levels of function. Our approach focuses on discovering what becomes possible when you accept what is and build from there. Tallis calls out Jennifer, one of our newest participants, a 10-year-old who was referred after struggling with severe social anxiety. What if you can't dance the same way you used to? Then you learn to dance the way you can now. Tallis replies without hesitation. The goal isn't to recreate the past. It's to discover what the present moment makes possible. It's a lesson that applies to more than movement. Over the past 5 years, I've watched hundreds of families grapple with children who don't fit conventional expectations. And I've worked with countless elderly people who believed their useful lives had ended. What I've learned is that our culture's obsession with independence, productivity, and normative behavior creates artificial barriers between people who could be helping each other. The intergenerational component isn't just programming creativity. It's recognition that wisdom and energy, experience and curiosity, patience and enthusiasm are resources that different age groups possess in different proportions. When you create authentic opportunities for exchange, everyone benefits in ways that isolated programming can't achieve. Dr. Chun, who now serves as our research director, approaches with her tablet and the kind of pleased expression that usually means good news about funding or evaluation results. The university partnership is approved, she says quietly. Full research collaboration, 3-year study. Significant funding for program documentation and replication training. This represents the culmination of years of work to establish our approach as evidence-based practice rather than feel-good programming. The academic validation will open doors to sustainable funding and policy influence that could impact how society thinks about aging, education, and the artificial barriers we create between generations. But watching Aria guide Jennifer through her first tentative movements, I'm reminded that the real validation happens in moments like this, when someone discovers they're capable of things they didn't know were possible. Dad, Aria says during a break in the session, Mrs. Rodriguez wants to know if we can start a program at her daughter's school. She thinks some of the kids there might benefit from what we do here. Mrs. Rodriguez's daughter Sophia has been participating for 8 months, transforming from a girl who couldn't sit still in traditional classrooms to someone who uses movement to help manage her attention and express complex emotions she doesn't yet have words for. What do you think? I ask Aria, are you ready to help start a school-based program? I think I've been ready for a while, she says. unconsciously echoing her response from years ago when I asked if she was ready to be a teacher. But Dad, I want to make sure we do it right. Not just bringing our program to their space, but creating something that fits who they are. At 12, my daughter understands program adaptation and community-responsive programming better than many adult practitioners. She's learned to read groups, to adjust activities based on participant needs, to recognize when someone is struggling and needs a different approach. These aren't skills that can be taught through traditional education. They're developed through authentic practice in environments where the stakes are real and the feedback is immediate. As the afternoon session winds down, families begin arriving for pickup. The conversations in our lobby have become as valuable as the formal programming, parents sharing strategies, elderly participants discussing projects they're working on together, young people making plans to practice techniques they've learned. James arrives for his weekly visit, a routine he's maintained despite now living permanently in California. His initial skepticism about the program has evolved into something approaching evangelical enthusiasm. He serves on our board of directors and has become one of our most effective advocates with potential funders. "How's our star teacher today?" he asks Aria. "Tired but happy," she replies. "We had 3 new participants today, and one of them figured out how to express anger through movement instead of yelling. That's always exciting." James looks at me with an expression of continued amazement. "You know, 5 years ago, I thought I was protecting my aunt from disappointment. I had no idea I was almost preventing something like this from existing." "You were doing what seemed right with the information you had," I reply. "That's all any of us can do. But you fought for something different when it would have been easier to accept my decision. I fought for Aria, everything else grew from there." Talis joins our conversation, moving her wheelchair with the practiced efficiency of someone who has long since stopped seeing mobility aids as limitations. "James, did you see Sophia's breakthrough today? She led the entire closing circle, something that would have been unimaginable when she started." "I did see that." "And Talis, do you ever miss performing? The applause, the audiences, the recognition?" Talis considers the question seriously. "I miss the adrenaline sometimes, the technical challenge of perfect execution. But I don't miss the isolation of individual achievement. What we do here is collaborative creation, community building through shared expression. It's different from performance, but it's not lesser." As families finish collecting their young people and the facility returns to its evening quiet, I find myself in the position I often occupy at day's end, reflecting on the distance between where we started and where we've arrived. 5 years ago, I was a struggling single father delivering groceries to make rent, watching my daughter disappear into herself while I ran out of conventional solutions. Today, I lead an organization that has demonstrated measurable impact on hundreds of lives while creating sustainable employment for dozens of people who understand that meaningful work often looks different from traditional career paths, but the transformation isn't just organizational. Aria has grown from a withdrawn 7-year-old into a confident young person who understands her sensitivity and intuition as gifts rather than obstacles. She advocates for herself when she needs accommodations, teaches others when she has knowledge to share, and moves through the world with the kind of authentic confidence that can only come from being deeply understood and accepted for who you are. TAHLISSE, at 88, has discovered that retirement from performance doesn't mean retirement from purpose. She's published a book about intergenerational arts programming, consulted with facilities across the country, and become a recognized expert in movement-based therapeutic approaches. Her legacy isn't just the stages she once graced, but the lives she continues to impact through patient, generous teaching. As for me, I've learned that sometimes the most important battles are fought not with weapons or strategies, but with persistence, creativity, and the willingness to believe that human connection can triumph over institutional inertia. Tonight, as every night, I'm grateful that I fought for what mattered instead of accepting what seemed easier. Because sometimes, when you refuse to let important connections be severed by bureaucratic convenience, you don't just save relationships, you create possibilities that change how people think about what's possible. If this story has touched you, we hope you'll consider how many connections in your own community might be waiting to happen. How many elderly people have knowledge they're never asked to share? How many young people might benefit from different approaches to learning and growth? And if you know someone who might benefit from what places like the Corvain Center offer, don't wait for permission or perfect timing. Sometimes the most beautiful things grow from the simple act of introducing people who need each other, even when the world insists they should remain apart. Thank you for spending this time with us. Until next time, remember that the most profound changes often begin with the smallest acts of courage, like bringing your daughter to meet someone whose wisdom the world has forgotten how to value. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.